After the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, there was a modern and new world. Many people were opposed to it, including the Romantics and conservatives, and they were firmly in control. What happened to the people in the 19th century that wanted even more change? Today we look at the rise of liberalism and socialism, the ideologies of change. We'll begin with liberalism. The background to liberalism, of course, comes from the Enlightenment and famous thinkers like John Locke, who argued for the rise of more rights. Of course, we see the rise of liberalism as well in the revolutions, such as the French and American Revolution. But it's important to consider that liberalism in the 19th century does not equal liberalism in the 21st century. Our liberals are more socialist, and if you're looking for a liberal party that represents 19th century liberalism, it's probably closer to the Republicans. Now, it's important to understand that at the beginning of the 19th centuries, it was the conservatives that dominated, especially after the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and 1815. But the liberals were slowly growing because they were firmly rooted in the middle class, which as a result of the Industrial Revolution were increasing in size. Now, in addition to this background, the most important characteristic of liberalism is a belief in liberty as a central principle in humanity. It is that people should be free from as many restraints as possible. People should have access to individual rights, and they should be protected from the government in that order that these individual rights will be safeguarded. We'll look at liberalism in three different categories. First, economic liberalism. Sometimes it's called classical liberalism or Manchester liberalism or laissez-faire capitalism. Now you can see that 19th century liberals were more akin to Republicans. Now they wanted no government regulation of the economy. They didn't want laws controlling what businesses could do or not do. Rather, the natural laws of supply and demand should drive the economy. So only in times of emergency, perhaps if there was a war and the defense of the country required that the government step in, or for law enforcement or public works, only in these few cases could the government be involved. Rather, for the most part, there should be a free exchange of goods between individuals. Therefore, they supported free trade amongst various nations. And they also wanted to get rid of institutions, not only government institutions, but also guilds and slavery that disturbed the freedom of individuals. The key thinker that you need to know for the birth of economic liberalism was Adam Smith. He published an important work, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. He believed that freedom through competition will produce the maximum economic growth. In addition to economic liberalism, you see political liberalism. The people should be free from constraints. Who constrains people? Well, people in power. And the government should protect the majority from those in power. There needs to be guarantees of liberals. So you see documents like in the United States, the Bill of Rights, or in France, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, that protect these freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and so forth. The government needs to be responsible to the people. This is not the case with a monarchy. You need a constitution, you need elected officials, and that any ministers that are appointed should be responsible to the people and not a monarch. Lastly, there's cultural liberalism. This means that there should be liberty in all aspects of life. Today we call these people libertarians. So there should be no restrictions when it comes to sexuality, religion, mental freedom. And almost anything goes. Gambling, prostitution, birth control, drugs. It's a bit progressive for the 19th century, but they only believe that you should be restricted in terms of self-defense. If it doesn't hurt you, then you should be able to, or another person, then you should be able to do it. The father of liberalism is John Stuart Mill. He wrote a couple key books, including On Liberty, arguing for the centrality of liberty. He also wrote on women, on the subjugation of women, in fact, and called for women to have rights and a sense of equality. Now, the biggest thing that they were fighting for was against unfree labor. Not just slave labor, but also indentured servants, serfs and peasants. The vast majority of people in history had been unfree laborers, and liberals wanted to end this practice. First, they targeted feudalism. These are the serfs that worked on the manors of the nobles. This ended, of course, in the French Revolution in the late 1700s, and Napoleon spreads this throughout Europe in the early 1800s. Franz Joseph famously ended feudalism in 1848 after a revolution in the Austrian Empire, and the last European country Then feudalism was Russia, which ended its feudalism in 1861. Think of feudalism, we think of the medieval period, but it lasted well into the 19th century. However, African slavery persists. Millions of slaves were taken from Africa to America to work on various plantations. The abolitionist movement, rooted in liberalism and this idea of freedom, begins to take on this issue. Of course, it has its origins as well in the Enlightenment. The French Revolution ended slavery only for it to be reinstated by Napoleon. It also has a movement, begins in the religious movements in England, including the Quakers and evangelicals. One famous individual that you should know in England is William Wilberforce, who fought to end slavery. They had allies with the economic liberals. Adam Smith, for example, thought it was bad economics to have unfree laborers. There was also slave rebellions. People in the situation of slavery wanted to revolt, the most famous being in Haiti, which was the only one that was successful on a large scale. As a result of this movement, England ended international slave trade in 1807, but they did not free their slaves yet. Finally, country by country started ending African slavery. The British did so after the Great Reform Act when the Liberal parties were elected in Britain, and they decided to end it in 1838 after a period of apprenticeship. Obviously, it took the Civil War in the United States to end slavery in the 1860s, and Brazil was the last country to end African slavery in 1888. In addition to liberalism, there's also socialism. Now, socialism defines society as a cooperative venture. That is not, we are not a group of individuals working on our own, but we're a group tied together with obligations to each other. That is, we should help each other. There's two different groups. When we think of socialism, we always think of Marx, but in reality, there is a movement of socialists before Karl Marx. Those are the utopian socialists. And then after that, there are the scientific socialists, and that is the group which Karl Marx belongs to. Now, the easiest way to tell them apart is pretty comical, as you'll see in the pictures, are the utopian socialists didn't have beards, and the scientific socialists had huge beards. Actually, there's more important distinctions, as I'll talk about in a second. Now, the utopians, obviously, because they were utopian, were very optimistic. They believed that the Industrial Revolution and economic liberalism led to a lot of horrible conditions. People were very poor. There were a lot of people starving because the Industrial Revolution focused on producing goods but not distributing them. And of course, this was happening in the beginning of the 19th century. So they look forward and say, hey, there's a way that we can solve this. And they were, of course, very optimistic in the future and believed that there could be cooperation and people could work together for a sense of equality instead of competition promoted by the economic liberals. They believed people were not evil, that people would work hard in the right environment and share. So they rejected private property, they rejected capitalism for this idea of cooperation. So some of the famous utopians are Charles Fourier, who decided that people should live in small, sustained communities. He had an idea that 1,620 people could live in the community. They could have common housing. They could work for each other. They could rotate jobs. They could have the equality of women and men, and basically live in this commune. Robert Owen was a British socialist. He had a mill in New Lanark, Scotland. He built housing for his workers. He gave them better working conditions. He provided schooling. It was a success, but when he tried to start a larger community, New Harmony in Indiana in the United States, it failed after 2 years. Another utopian was Louis Blanc. He wrote a book called Organization of Work. He wanted the government to get involved. And he said that the government should finance workshops, but they would be owned and controlled by the workers. Everyone would be guaranteed a job at these workshops, and they would have financial security. All of these things didn't pan out because, as you can imagine, people don't like to share. They like to compete. So therefore, the utopian socialists and their endeavors long-term were not successful. Karl Marx was leader of the socialist movement after the utopians, and he became what was known as the scientific socialist. Karl Marx was a German thinker. He had a doctorate in history and philosophy, and his radical ideas, though, got him kicked out of Germany and also kicked out of France. He ended up living in London. He makes acquaintance with Friedrich Engels, who is the son of a manufacturer, and he collaborates with Karl Marx. The key text that they produced was the Communist Manifesto, which outlines their ideas, and also Das Kapital, a critique of capitalism. So they were critical of the utopians because they lacked a real impact on the working class, and it wasn't really practical or revolutionary. So he comes up with a new idea called historical materialism, saying that whatever produces the goods is a key factor in history. That what your economic structure is the basis of your government, your religion, culture. All of that flows from economics. And he looked at history and he said there's different periods: communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and communism. And that will progress through these different periods based on how things are produced. He believed that in each society that there are two forces, two classes fighting each other. Hegel, who is an important philosopher, called it the thesis and antithesis. Karl Marx calls it these two classes. And in his particular age, it was the middle class, or the bourgeoisie, who owned the means of production. They owned the machines. And the other class was the working class, or the proletariat, who didn't own the means of production. They sold their labor to the middle class. And these two classes, he believed, would fight every war, every struggle as a clash between the haves and the have-nots. And he believed that eventually this clash is going to lead to a revolution, such in the past that, for example, the peasants revolted against the barons, the nobles, and produced in the French Revolution and produced an industrial society. So his predictions for the future were that industrial society was going to get worse and worse. The middle class would get richer and richer and smaller, and the working class would get bigger and bigger and poorer, and eventually the workers would revolt. And when the workers revolt, they would seize the means of production. They would seize the property. They would abolish actually any private ownership of property and create a classless society. When there's no more classes, there'd be no more fighting. The government would cease, and it would be a communist classless workers' paradise. Of course, his prediction did not pan out. That said, he had a huge impact in history. It's undeniable. We, of course, talk about class and class conflict today, and of course there's numerous countries that try to enact his communist and socialist policies. So now we've seen these two ideologies, let's look at them in action. The first revolt for change was the revolutions of 1830. It began in France. Charles X was the monarch, and he was very conservative. And when the liberals received an electoral victory, they seized the initiatives and tried to enact change. But Charles X fought back. He censored the press, he ended the assembly, he reduced the electorate, and what ends up happening is that there's a revolution against him. Moderates seize control, and they ask for a constitutional monarch. So they get rid of the king, Charles X, and they replace him with a cousin, Louis Philippe, who was a moderate. And so therefore, France goes from an absolute monarch to a constitutional monarch. The reforms were very limited. They increased the electorate, which allowed the middle class to vote, but the workers and the artisans were not allowed to vote. So it was what I would say a half revolution. Now there's a joke. Whenever France gets sneezes, Europe catches a cold. I know that's not funny, but it's a history joke. But whenever France has a revolution, everybody else decides to have a revolution. So Belgium had a nationalistic revolution in 1830 after they were inspired by the French. They revolted from the Netherlands, which they were part of. They have a different religion, different language, and so therefore they revolted from the Dutch. They received international help, and Belgium became an independent country. Italy also revolted. There was revolts in Parma and Bologna and Modena, but the Austrians move in and they crush the rebellions. Poland, which was controlled by the Russians, they revolt, but nobody comes to their aid, and the Russian Tsar Nicholas moves in, crushes the rebellion. Thousands of people flee, and the Russians enact a harsh military dictatorship, so it fails, and they have a pretty horrible situation in Poland to follow. Britain did not have a revolution per se. Instead, they had a reform. The Liberal Party, the Whigs, came to power, and they passed a Reform Act, which allowed more districts to send members to Parliament in cities and towns. They increased the amount of people that could vote, which allowed the middle class to vote. People wanted, of course, universal male suffrage, all men to vote. This movement was called the Chartists, but they failed, at least initially, when they presented their petitions to Parliament in 1839, 1842, and 1848. So business was in power, the middle class was satisfied after this Reform Act, and there was no bloodshed, no revolutions. Now, the year of revolutions that was unprecedented was 1848. Again, it starts where else but in France. There was economic depression, there was a lack of reforms, people were upset with Louis Philippe, and when Louis Philippe bans a political banquet, it turns violent. The National Guard refuses to fight on and joins the rebellion, and Louis Philippe flees to England. A provisional government is set up. They write a new constitution with universal suffrage. They start the socialist ideas enacted, which I explained, by Louis Blanc, which was the idea to set up workshops to give work to all the unemployed. But when the election actually comes in, the results, it's actually monarchists and moderate liberals that win. So therefore, they're scared of the socialists, and they close the workshops. The unemployed people get very upset. There's riots, but the moderates unleash the army, and they kill thousands of rioters. And what ends up happening is you get another constitution that is very conservative. There's a president, and after there's an election for this presidency, guess who wins? The nephew of Napoleon. After a couple of years, he decides to make himself emperor, and we have another emperor on the throne of France, Napoleon III. It's like the French cannot decide whether they want to be a democracy or a monarchy. Following France's example, there are revolutions across Central Europe. There's riots in Germany. There's a Frankfurt Assembly. All the different states send their representatives to Congress in Frankfurt to make a new liberal state, a constitutional monarchy. They decide to offer the throne of this constitutional monarchy to Frederick William IV, and he refuses it because it's too liberal. There's revolutions all across the Austrian Empire, in Prague and Vienna and Budapest. At first, they give in. Metternich, who's the leader of the conservatives, is forced to remove from power. The king, Ferdinand I, is to abdicate. Young ruler Franz Joseph comes to power. But what ends up happening is hundreds of thousands of Russian troops are sent in to crush the rebellion, and therefore liberal revolts in Prague and Budapest and Vienna are crushed. Once Austria regains its throne, they crush the rebellions in Italy, and the revolutions of 1848 turn out to be a failure. So the question is, why is it a failure? Well, the monarchs remain in power, they remain united, and they lend soldiers to each other. The Russians send in soldiers to crush the rebellions in Austria. The Prussian army crushes rebellions in the German states. The Austrians crush the rebellions in the Italian states. Their monarchs use their armies to band together and not fight each other, but to support each other. Many people say this is a turning point in history that did not turn. This was the time when democracy should have come to existence, but it didn't. The monarchs remained in force. So there's two main ideologies that we talked about. Liberalism, this belief in liberty and freedom and equality. Socialism, this idea of cooperation and working together. Unfortunately, they were crushed, and what you saw was the establishment of absolute monarchies. Why were they unsuccessful? As I mentioned, the monarchs band together. There was also a lack of unity between the revolutionaries. The middle class did not work with the working class. They were concerned about order. There was a lack of national cooperation. The different groups revolting, the Polish, the Hungarians, the Italians, the Czechs, they fought each other. They didn't work together. So what ends up happening is absolute monarchs remain in power, and they turn to a new force, nationalism, which we'll hear about in the next lecture. And monarchs and nationalism combined together, we get the unfortunate result of World War I.